Hello, thanks for tuning in at this new episode of our Unlocked podcast. We are here today at the Omada Identity Security Tour in Utrecht. I have here today with me some interesting colleagues. I'm going to start with myself. My name is Roman Peeters, part of IdentIT, working in the identity security space. I also have a colleague of mine also working at IdentIT.
Yes, hello. I'm Yannick Verschueren, also indeed working at IdentIT, a digital security expert, working also in the IGA branch of security, which we will go into much deeper this podcast.
Mm-hmm. And we also have some very interesting guests from Omada itself. So also, can you quickly introduce yourself? I'm going to start with you, Iwan.
Yeah, that's fine. My name is Iwan Dijkstra. I've been with Omada for about 4.5 years, being in the identity security space for almost 10. Worked with you guys in a different capacity before I joined Omada, so it's great to be back, talking to you more about identity and in specific about IGA. My role at Omada is that I'm a country lead for Belgium, amongst others. Mm-hmm. And looking forward to delve more into the topic of IGA today.
Yeah, and I'm Mads Peitersen. I've been with Omada for 8 years now. Started my journey in the consultancy level, delivered projects, evolved into architecture, stepped into the commercials, and now working as a field strategist, where I'm taking more of the strategic initiatives and working on larger prospects and how to evolve our product.
All right, cool. As I mentioned, we are here today at the Omada Identity Security Tour. What are your expectations for today, Iwan?
Well, I think this is, we used to do user groups, very much focused around our existing customers and partners, and I think we are evolving a little bit this year. We are stepping into the realm of collaboration with other technology partners. We've got Illimity and Thales, for example, here today. The number of attendees is much bigger than the previous years, so cool. All in all, very high expectations of the day. I think we've got a great program, great speakers. So, I think it's going to be amazing.
Okay, yeah. Right. Let's start it off then. Maybe, Mads, because I know you're a little bit more of a technical guy, could you quickly describe IGA and the positioning within identity security, just to introduce to our listeners and watchers?
Absolutely. So I think many people actually get this wrong when they talk about IGA, because IGA is often confused with IAM. Mm-hmm. But the way that we see it, and I think the way that the market see it, is that the IAM is the broader space, where IGA, identity governance and administration, is a part of it, where other parts will be PAM and other sorts of solutions. We are a pure breed IGA vendor, and we work within that space where we focus on the identities, of course, authorizations, compliance, governance, trying to make customers survive audits.
Okay, cool. I also know that the journey of Omada is a little bit more interesting. Could you maybe go into that as well? Because you're now a little bit more switching into a partner-first strategy. Where does it come from? How did it evolve the past years?
There's a few things, I guess, to mention here. Omada is a 26-year-old company to begin with. And the origins are very much more of a consulting business. So, Omada was a consultancy company that helped businesses out with identity-related challenges around SAP, around Microsoft MIM, FIM kind of space, and that company started building solutions to support that. And those solutions evolved into what the product is today. The Omada Identity Suite or the Omada Identity Cloud, and because we used to be a services company, we for a long time, software was a nice byproduct to get a lot of services sold. I think after the private equity came into play, or 2018, we've really switched to a software first model, although we still had a very strong consultancy arm. Mm-hmm. And I think we're now we've matured in such a way that we are really flipping that to. Yes, we do have consultancy, and we're not shying away from keeping them, but rather than deploying them directly at our customers, we are really deploying them together with our partners to help our partners mature more quickly and to grow, through our partners rather than delivering all the projects directly ourselves. So that is the direction of travel that we're on now.
Do you already see the benefits of that approach, maybe?
Absolutely, and I'll also say that the name has kind of switched throughout time of this consultancy arm. It was called professional services at some point, and that really talks into what it was. Mm-hmm. Then it switched to customer success. That's a lot more telling. And today it's called the customer experience team, which is everything from the first time you speak with us until the journey ends at some point. And I think that says a lot. And our customers hopefully feel it as well, because this arm of Omada is no longer a professional services arm. It's a churn minimizer to make the success of the customer as great as possible, as fast as possible, for everyone's good, of course, not just because the more they use the product, the more sticky it is and the more they want it, but also they get more value out of it. And I think that in combination with enabling partners to do the same is really driving the growth.
Yeah, I agree. And I also note from your expertise of the professional services that you provided, you also have some frameworks and some learned, or how do you say it, some stuff you learned over the years, for instance, the Identity Process Plus framework, etc.
Yeah.
We're not going to go too much into detail on that, but one thing that you also do is the State of IGA report that you yearly also provide. And Yannick and I, we had a look, and we had some interesting thoughts. So we'll talk about a little bit more on that.
Yes, I think that will be indeed the guideline for this podcast, because there is lots of interesting stuff in that paper. But I think one of our first questions is the most respondents in this paper, because the paper is actually sort of a conclusion of a
State of IGA.
State of IGA, which were questionnaires that were given to companies. But most of the respondents are leaders rather than practitioners. Was this a deliberate choice, and how do you see this resulted in the actual responses?
Yes, so it's deliberate for, I guess, a few reasons. One is that when we are out in the market and we are selling our technology to companies that might have a need for it, we see that it's not a technological project. So it's very much anchored with the business. So we need business leadership to be involved in setting the internal strategy at the customer, building a vision and a roadmap for how to deploy this, but also securing funds, budgets, resources, because this is not a project, this is a program. And I think that's also one thing that many people get wrong when thinking about IGA. They approach it like a technical project, something that you implement in a few months, and then it works, and then maybe a bit of maintenance and an upgrade every now and then. But that's not what IGA is. IGA is very much about using this technology to support the business processes around who has access to what assets in the business. And I think sometimes it's too much approached as a technical problem, but it's very much a business problem. Who do you give permission to do certain things, or to enter certain rooms, or read certain documents, right? And that's really what IGA is about. So I think from that perspective, it's very important to look at, what do leaders see? And not just from an identity perspective, because they have a much broader view on the security posture of an organization, versus at the same time, but what do our identity specialists see? People working on and with identity solutions every day. And there's some interesting contrasts that we can see as a result in that report. So I think we need both perspectives to understand, get a more holistic view on, where is this actually going?
Yes, indeed, because I think one of the highlighted differences in the paper is the difference between executive perception and actual operational reality. I think that the difference between those two is it's quite highlighted in the paper, which is indeed one of the reasons that it's important to always involve your business, but also your IT, because they are the ones that are actually using your identities, doing your security, basically. So you need these two layers.
I think you need both to harmonize a project in the right way. And I think we've seen many examples of either or, where either the technical team is on board, but they don't have the funding and the support of the business to move, and therefore they get stuck. And the other way around is that if there's a high-level executive decision to buy IGA, but the technical team's not ready to start deploying and deliver, and the resources are allocated, then you just hit bottlenecks everywhere in the project and you never really get anywhere. So it definitely needs to be an organizational decision rather than a one department thing.
And what would you say is the main manner or the main method to get that harmony of both perspectives?
I think it starts already in the sales cycle. We see a lot that that one of the teams are not involved in the sales cycle. And if we see that, we try to address it up front, because a sales cycle is really only a sales cycle. The moment that it moves into implementation, you should already have done a lot of prerequisite work. And if not, then you're just delaying the project and the time to value. So already there, we start addressing the leaders and the teams what to expect. If we know that they have a timeline that starts 2 months from now, already start preparing with these things. If you have them ready up front, we're able to move a lot faster. So that's what we're trying to do in the sales cycle already.
It's interesting. I sometimes, tongue-in-cheek, joke a little bit that the people I'm talking to, they're also in sales because they need to sell this internally.
Yeah.
And it's not just to their security leader, but it could be that they need to sell the idea to the ERP team, right? Because we very often see ERP teams that have their own setup and their own authorization management. And these guys need to be on board. HR need to be on board. Digital workplace experience needs to be on board. So it's helping, we often talk to identity practitioners and maybe a security leader, but it's also helping them and arming them with, okay, how can you position this into your own business? And how do you get these crucial teams that Mads were mentioning, how do you get them involved and on board and bought into this? Because that will determine the success of your program.
And it becomes political as well, because sometimes you meet organizations that have bought a technology, and then you reach out to the teams that you need to work with, and they feel threatened sometimes, that some people come in and they get a sense that they're about to automate the work that they do every day. And that's not what we're doing. We're supposed to enable them and make them focus on more core stuff than the manual tasks that they probably have at hand. And that alignment also needs to be in place. Otherwise, the project doesn't really start that well.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. One of the other findings is also that the investment drivers is the report basically concludes that the compliancy part is and audit efficiency is one of the main investment drivers. But why do you think that identity visibility in general and the security aspect is not in the executive board? They don't see it as a main investment driver, but do you think that there is a reason for this?
I think there's a change about to happen in that space. I think we had to get to it at some point, of course, but I think the whole nature of AI agents require a lot more visibility into your landscape. Whereas before it was a bit trivial, it was your human workforce and your partners, and they are just more visible in nature. But now we have these agents lying around everywhere, and you need to know where they are, what they're doing, what they're capable of. And I think we're going to see a major shift in that, and that's also going to change the perception of executives in why they're buying these platforms, because it's also going to be a question that they have to answer to the boards and the others in their organization.
Yeah, indeed, I agree. The AI agents will definitely go into that a little bit later on, but maybe first
on compliance, I would say compliance remains very relevant. Particularly in Europe, we've got NIS2, we've got DORA. We've got all these local initiatives even that really require organizations to think about, how they go around this and what they can present back to auditors or to regulators. So this is not going away. I think what to Mads's point, I think it will only become a bigger issue now with the explosion of non-human type identities, but mostly IA agents, right? We've had non-human identities for a long time, and we've been addressing them also for quite a long time. But the agentic AI, that is, I think, one of the key reasons why there's more focus on identity security, and in particular, we actually were talking yesterday in the lobby of the hotel, right? It's like people are still solving the same problems as 10 years ago, and we see that there's still a need for the foundational stuff around human identities, around compliance, around meeting these regulations. Also because under these new regulations, the board is actually responsible, and this also changes the perception and the priority. So, although I fully agree on what's happening with AI, this compliance thing won't go away. Accountability won't go away. If something goes wrong, somebody needs to be accountable. It's not going to be the AI agent. So,
shouldn't the security driver be? And that's maybe what you're saying as well. That it's gonna switch. That security becomes a way bigger, important priority because
100%. Yeah. So security. If you do security well, compliance should be a natural product of what you're doing around security, right?
Yeah,
And we've seen a lot of customers in the past that, and compliance is a great driver, by the way, for a new project, right? If you get a slip on the wrist from the auditors and the auditors say, like, you don't have your stuff under control, it's a great reason to invest, which is, sometimes good news for us because it means that they move fast. But some people, some organizations have only taken it to that extent. It's like, okay, now we tick the boxes, now we're done, right? And I think that is the shift that you're talking about, and I think we all agree, is that the security piece becomes more and more important, and that we're going to measure that a lot more than just compliance reports. Compliancy will come as a result of that, but it's still a driver.
And you don't think that, because we were talking recently with compliancy officer within Kronos, which is the mother company of our own company, and he was talking about lots of companies that were just being compliant for being the sake of compliance. So is there, he saw there was a bit of a, sort of a trend to just have the compliancy, have that sort of medal that you're compliant, but might not be secure. And we also see from the EU and the governing bodies that there are going to be more and more of these compliance or these rule sets. So is there no sort of fear from you guys that companies are just trying to be as compliant as possible without actually increasing their security?
Just ticking the boxes.
Yes, just optimizing their governance just for compliance's sake and not really security.
I definitely think it's a risk because obviously they have to be compliant. A lot of these companies, compliancy is their license to operate as a business, so that checkbox exercise has to be exercised. That's a given. But I don't see it as a risk. When we work with customers and we evolve their maturity, it is about evolving their compliance and security at the same time. When we drive maturity levels at customers, it is to introduce more access controls, more life cycle in everything they do, make sure that we manage all identity populations and all accounts of that identity population. So that also drives the security. So I think it goes very much hand in hand, but we do talk with customers a lot to not make it an exercise, a checkbox exercise, but actually get value out of it. Because sometimes it seems like it's the easy path. They've kind of done what their superiors say they needed to do, but they didn't really get anything out of it. And that's where we don't want to be.
Yeah. And I think traditionally, if you look at the likes of Gartner and such, they always had 3 focus areas around IGA, one being efficiency. So automating these lifecycle projects, so reducing manual work, tickets and things like that. Security as a second one, and then compliance was a third. They've added a fourth one, which is business enablement. Because if you automate well, you probably become more secure, right? Because you start executing the policy.
As a combination of the 3 then, basically. Or?
If you do it well. And the starting point is different sometimes. We come across customers who have compliance as a starting point. They got a slap on the wrist from the auditors. But we also have companies that say, "Wow, we've got so much manual work, and and we know it's not secure because we know we're not removing all of the accounts." They have a very big focus on that automation piece. But at the end of the day, all of that kind of goes together. And if you do that well, then you enable your business to operate at a higher velocity and at a in a more secure way. So I think that adaptation is still true, but I think the focus on security, and I think the report also highlights to some extent, is that what are we reporting today, and what are actually the things that we actually want to know. And it's a bit between, okay, so what are the there's some key indicators like, okay, how many times have we done a recertification campaign versus what have we actually prevented? What have we actually secured, like from a security perspective? And I think there's more awareness on that. So I think that's I think it's a good point in your question, is that security awareness, absolutely, and I think the AI agents only help that discussion. But I think it will remain for a long time a combination of operational efficiency, security, compliance, and therefore you enable your business to operate.
It's interesting you mentioned Gartner, because they recently introduced a new category, the identity, visibility, and intelligence platforms. Where do you see them coming in within the IGA space?
I think they complement each other a lot, especially in the different stages of projects. I think we have players in the market who do visibility who are very fast to value. And depending very much where an organization is, they can get to value way faster in these visibility platforms than it is rolling out an entire IGA program. I would say there are probably some overlaps, but it's complementary overlaps. And that's also why we work together with other technology partners, of course. But it's an easy way to get visibility into your unknown parts of your organization. And I think that's a core part of knowing how to shape your IGA strategy afterwards. Because if you don't know what you have today and what your organization looks like, it's very tough moving into IGA as a whole. Because there are a lot more decisions or other kinds of decisions that you need to make because you're managing the organization and all the accounts, all the identities more in full, where the visibility is sometimes limited to the visibility, which is good as a starting point.
Yeah.
I think another positive thing about doing it, as you're saying, Mads, is that if you start doing that, with that insight, you can already start taking some action, some corrective action. So you might get to the start of an IGA project with, let's say, a better posture, a better data quality. Already, you maybe clean up some stuff. So I think ahead of an IGA project, there's definitely value there.
As a Kickstarter, basically.
Yes, as a Kickstarter, helping your IGA project to also start in a better, more controlled way. It might also help with crafting the business case, for further identity investment. On the other hand, if you already have IGA today, taking an IVIP approach. I think historically with IGAs, like when people onboard a system, they don't just onboard for visibility. They want to do the whole thing. And sometimes that takes a bit more time because you need to involve the business owners and people have opinions and they're not available and they don't understand. So just getting visibility is a great way to also expand
and also
on top of your IGA.
Report to the executives basically as well.
I think it boils down to one of the core common cases that we see in our space, which is I think we have a problem with our join and move a lever, especially our lever process. And then that's maybe the thesis. Then you get visibility on it, and it confirms the thesis. Okay, we have a ton of non-off-boarded accounts of people we know that have left and it should not be there, the orphan accounts. That can create the business case. If you already start visualizing all that, which is of course a threat to the organization, you can not only clean up, as you say, so that you mitigate the stuff that you see immediately, but then you can start planning for further ahead. How do we fix this more on a structural level going forward? And I think that's really where they complement each other.
Actually, the report basically it states that that on reporting towards executives, it states that the executives tend to see more or focus more on the operational metrics like provisioning speed. How fast can somebody start with doing their job, basically, and they're focusing on this. But why do you think that the other risk indicators, like orphan accounts, why are they undervalued or underreported?
I think there could be many reasons for it. I think there is a tendency to always be very commercially minded sometimes. As an executive, it's the numbers that make sense. And the first examples that you mentioned are very numbers focused. Can people start working the day that they step in? Do we not have loss in productivity? All that kind of good stuff, which it also needs to enable. But unless you've kind of been traumatized before by an accident, maybe the orphan accounts are not what you think about immediately. But they are the things that can make the most damage to your organization. So obviously, they should have a lot greater focus. I think that's also what we're trying to educate. But sometimes people do need to be educated, and I fully agree that it should have its weight.
But I think this also comes back to what you said in the beginning, where leadership needs to work with their IT teams, because these security risks is usually something that is seen within your security team, within your IT team, which might not be reported to the board, which it might be sort of a communication issue between leadership and practitioners, which is
it's also an ownership issue, right? Because so we talk about risk. So when we see attacks happening, it's on these tail accounts. It's on non-rotating credentials. We see attacks happening on APIs and those kind of workloads as well that have non-rotating credentials. They're used to break in. Through that, you get admin access to something else. So there needs to be control over these assets because they are more and more often being used to actually break into your organization from a risk perspective. And then the question is, and this was the question I remember I presented about this, is that, okay, but who owns that? right? And then it's IT security. But they also can't control what they can't see. So we've got people working in application teams, developers, and they are creating all of these, agentic workloads and APIs that runs all sorts of things. And the security teams just don't know about it. And I think this is where the visibility piece becomes really relevant, not just on identities itself, but all these other connected workloads, systems, agents, to actually be able to build something around it. So visibility was always important, but I think the importance has only increased over the past year and a half or so, ever since they introduced the category.
Yeah, indeed. All right. There's also a lot of talk within the report about zero trust adoption, and it's compared to practical implementation. Can you maybe introduce zero trust, because there are multiple definitions out there, and I'm basically lost.
Well,
so
give me yours.
Ooh, my understanding of zero trust is that every transaction or every connection, or on a technical level, should be validated and should be tested or checked before allowing at all times. Indeed, that's the general gist of zero trust. But I don't know if that's
never trust, always validate. That's
never trust, always validate. Indeed, but is that the correct, or where do you draw the line? Because from my technical background, I don't see a lot of use cases where they really have a fully every transaction, and you can go as deep as every TCP connection, you can go further down the stream, as you could say, but where does it stop, or where do you start? I don't know.
Well, it doesn't stop anywhere, does it?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's because the speed of which things are happening. I think teams can't keep up. That's one. I think there's too many new technologies, too many things, and the teams can't keep up to protect. So that's a challenge. From let's say from an IGA perspective, an identity perspective, there's a lot of talk about continuous access control, adaptive. We have got role-based access, we've got attribute-based access, and they make a lot of sense in terms of I work in sales, so I need access to our CRM system. That's a given. But the question is, do I also need it at 11 at night from China, for example? I wouldn't. That would be flex. And so it's. I think that's kind of the next step. So we have got a lot of standing access, right? And there's a lot of talk about, that's all good and well, that you can access the CRM at every time of day and from everywhere you are. But maybe we should start, assessing a little bit more as, should this access be granted now? And I think that's kind of the next evolution or the next step. We see a lot of policy-based access control, things like that come into play. I'm not sure if that's a pure IGA thing. I think it is as much, at time of authentication, right? So you authenticate, it's like, there's a user for Iwan, that's great. But now we're going to check, the context in which he's logging in, and should we still grant access even though he has an account? I think that is what I know a lot of larger organizations that are maybe a little bit more mature in their identity setup are really looking at, to help kind of validate a bit more frequently based on security policies, broader security policies. That could be one thing where I think zero trust and identity kind of are moving a bit further ahead.
Yeah, I think the just-in-time piece has a lot to say in here. Like, is your standing access, is it on a schedule, meaning that is it deactivated from the evening till the next morning and only active in your working times? Or is it truly just-in-time that you have to always request whenever you need it? I think that's definitely one piece. And then tying an IGA solution into the identity fabric, using signals from other solutions to make sure that we're reacting to everything out there. Because as an IGA solution, you don't see everything because you don't control everything, but you can get the feeds from everything to react to everything. And here a very common example is what you mentioned, tying up to your identity provider, the one doing all the authentication. Is Entra seeing anything that's off? And if it is, it should alert us, because we're the one who can then lock down that identity and deactivate everything about it, because we're the central piece from that perspective. And I think that's that's where zero trust becomes more, ties into the identity fabric. How do we work together, all the different vendors or the platforms in the solution, to make sure we have things under control and that we react sometimes, but also are proactive wherever we can be. And that's one thing. And then I think there's the completely other side of things where the zero trust is also a focus on the vendor. So can the vendor give a zero trust approach to the setup of the platform? And here we talk a lot about the bring your own key phenomenon. Can they decrypt my data if they wanted to, or can I bring my own key and then I'm secure in that way? I think we also see that quite a bit. Also, when we talk about how do we integrate to on-premise systems, do we need a client on our side? And that client, what can you do with that? Is that also something that we can encrypt? I think there's also an entire aspect of that is getting more focused. I think that's also where the market is going. They want to be more sovereign in terms of what they can control on their side. And zero trust has a lot to say in that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the paper also claims that 95% of organizations say they do zero trust or they do something with zero trust. But a lot of these companies also struggle with visibility. So do you think that there is a sort of a misrepresentation of what zero trust actually means within these companies? Are they, maybe also because of marketing around zero trust? And do you think there is some sort of, difference between one company's zero trust versus another company's zero trust, and they all just call it zero trust, but maybe it's not actually zero trust?
A bit. I think if you can say that you have zero trust in your organization, it has to be comprehensive to a certain extent. Otherwise, it kind of loses its meaning a little bit. But I think a lot of people are trying to implement zero trust, and I think a very just-in-time access is one thing. Doing access reviews and people having not answered the questions in an access review results in people losing access because whatever access review wasn't answered. That we take the zero trust approach, deprovision whatever was not validated once more, and then if that person still needs it, well, then they need to request it again. I think those are the low-hanging fruits that people can take, and I think a lot of them are taking those steps so they can start saying that we're adopting zero trust
Can I maybe
practices.
conclude it that then it's basically they're adopting the mindset and using the principles of zero trust to
be more secure,
to decide on security questions that they get, whether or not we deprovision accounts, that we then go for the zero trust mindset and yes, we deprovision whenever possible, or if there's any risk.
It's a scale, isn't it? I mean, we're looking at it a little bit through an identity lens, of course, because that's what we do. But I think there's a lot of other, stuff out there that we don't really work too much directly with. And I think looking through an identity lens again, we also see how mature our people say, we have identities under control. So, well, that means something very different in one organization than the other. I think it's probably the same for zero trust. I think every security leader, would say, yes, we are working on zero trust. You kind of have to. But what that exactly means.
And what lens are you using, indeed? And I think that's basically answers my question from the beginning. Like, at what level do you introduce zero trust? And you can, from an identity point of view, you made that clear that it's basically the mindset on how you would approach security questions. So
and that's the same with all these compliancy frameworks, right? Like NIS2 encompasses a lot, but there are certain elements of it that are very identity related. So we look at it, okay, so from an identity perspective, what could we contribute to you becoming NIS2 compliant? So how can we contribute with your zero trust strategy? I think, depending on who you ask, and maybe that's also like if you ask certain identity protectionists, it's like, from an identity perspective, we're actually quite good. Right? Where others might say, well, actually, we are still on the beginning of our journey, and I think that's for every framework, and the ones that have lasted, and some of the ones that have disappeared over time. I mean, who remembers Carta, right?
Nope.
But from an identity perspective, I think identity has a major role to play in a zero trust for obvious reasons, right? And
but a journey, just like IGA, like you need to cover a lot of area, and you won't be doing it overnight.
No.
All right, let's take the bridge then and do the jump to AI agents. How do they come in, and how would you approach a zero trust mindset towards AI agents, or is that a good approach to take for AI agents maybe?
Well, first I'll say that is evolving day by day these days. So I think one strategy that can be taken today might not be the best one tomorrow, just because of the nature of it.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer, whatever I say. But I think Zero Trust has a lot to say when it comes to AI agents. Standing access, I think, is an absolute no-go for AI agents. It needs to be an activation mode of some sort when it comes to these agents. They're working at warp speed, but they need to have access to do things so fast. I think what we're seeing a little bit, our customers talk about, is the ability to provide pre-approved access for AI agents, but they always need to sign up for the access when they need to use it. So it gets activated the just-in-time moment that they need it. They use it for whatever they need to do, which of course has to be a very defined and approved purpose, and then it's deactivated right afterwards. So that you can see what they're allowed to do to fulfill their purpose, but you always have the logs of whenever they checked it out to do whatever they needed to do, and it's then taken away again. Because it cannot be the old school fashioned way of requesting something, getting it approved, because we don't work at that speed. Humans don't work at that speed, so it needs to be another setup.
It's interesting. I was moderating during Identity Management Day some weeks back, and I was moderating a session with Martin Coopinger and with Simon Moffat, and both are known industry analysts, thinking leaders, and Martin Coopinger had a little bit of a kind of a model. So first, back to visibility, you need to discover. You need to know what is out there. Then somehow you need to be able to tie it to somebody who's responsible for that. Could be that it's tied to a policy, which is tied to a person, right? But there needs to be a human in the loop somewhere still, and this is also an accountability question. Only then can you start looking at behavior and intent. And we see some vendors that are already doing these kind of things, which is not necessarily identity, but it's much more behavioral and intent driven. And I think intent is interesting because when I was talking to Simon Moffat, he said, well, you've got agents infecting agents. So at some point you get zombie agents, right? And zombie agents means just as much as like you've sent out an agent with an intent, right? Under a certain policy. That agent needs to interact with another agent, which injects it with something that it, so it's kind of like that zombie virus, I guess, And so it, from that perspective, to your point, Mads, right? It needs to be switch on, switch off, because at the speed, machine speed, human speed, there's a lot of talk about this. It's uncontrollable. You need AI to defend yourself against AI. So we need to find ways of, and here it's still quite complicated, and it changes every day, to your point. And I don't think vendors have the answers yet. Everybody's just deploying this without really thinking about security. That's the truth, right?
But why do you think that organizations are willing to deploy all those agents that can basically break everything? Is there a reason for this without thinking of security?
The obvious one is like, hey, if we are not doing this, our competitors will move faster than we do. Or if we're not doing it, we're seen as laggers, or our employees think we're laggers. So everybody's jumping on the train because they have to. The whole AI race, not to get too political, but you see the investments happening in China, in the US, and here, it's seen as the next shift of world power again, and there's a lot
can't afford to not do it.
That's the point. That's the point. You have to do it. So you accept the risk, I guess, and most companies accept the risk.
But what I've seen customers talk more about now that we're talking about agents is the ownership piece.
Yes.
Because there is so much uncertainty on the AI agent front that now the owner becomes central. They need to be accountability of someone who then takes the accountability of whatever is going to happen, because it is uncertain. But it's important that there is someone assigned as an owner to all these things. And that has kind of spread from not only the non-human ones, but into everything in our IGA space. So not just AI agents, but also who owns a resource, who owns a system, who takes responsibility for what. I think that's a good thing that it brought with it.
Indeed.
And you will actually be showing stuff later today on what we're thinking and what we're building, and of course, as an IGA player, we also need to move with the pace of the world, right? And it's not easy. There's different complexities when it comes to actually mapping or discovering AI agents versus a human identity. So
Can we say that it's a new identity type that's being introduced instead of the non-human identities that's been there for quite some time? But is it a new
it's a subcategory.
subcategory indeed,
of the
where the ownership is more important than our?
But I think it deserves its own type, or at least category to some extent, due to the nature of how it operates. If you work with the typical non-human identity being a service account somewhere, I think that nature is a lot more static and predictable. AI agents are the complete opposite. Or they shouldn't be, but they kind of are these days. So I think they need to be operated and governed in a very different way.
What we also seen in the research is that businesses are also using AI to improve their governance processes. So we've been talking about governing the AIs, but you can also use AI for governance. But do you also see the possibility that using AI for your governance process, while it's not really mature yet, might amplify its weaknesses rather than only doing good?
Well, initially, yes.
Initially, will amplify your weaknesses because you will start seeing what where you're lacking, and it will start bringing that into play. But once you have that, then you can start using AI to actually improve this, right? So I think it's a bit of a, it gets bad and then it gets better kind of curve.
And I think AI lives and breathes on data, and it needs to have good data. And I think it'll amplify whether or not you have good data. And a very good example is the typical use case of AI in governance processes being in an access review. So the AI will let you know what its recommendation is. But what is this based on? What is that recommendation based on? And it needs to be based on a good set of data. Otherwise, that recommendation ends up being either wrong or...
Garbage out.
Exactly. And I think people need to be aware of this, that it's not magic. It looks like magic sometimes, but it's always going to be based on data. And if you don't have good data in your IGA solution in this case, it will not provide a good recommendation. So what does good data mean? Well, it can mean what is all the metadata that you have on your resources that you govern? Do you have labels on them as to what this actually provides access to? What is the risk level of this resource? Who owns it? And then again, who else has this resource in your organization and your peers that kind of look like you from a contextual point of view? If you have that in place, then I think it can be awesome at accumulating all that input and providing it in a very digestible manner for someone who is completely non-technical to make a pretty good decision. But if you don't have all that, then I'm not sure what that AI recommendation is actually based on and whether you can use it for anything.
What would you then recommend to current security practitioners, CISOs, whatever, information security officers? What would you then recommend to them based on all the things we've talked about and the findings within the report? What should their priority be at this point?
I mean, just to then follow that stream of before, I think they should look into their data. Many programs, they have a way of integrating a lot of systems into their IGA solution. It monitors and reacts to authorizations, and that's all great. But the moment that you start to really use data for proper access controls, that data needs to be in place. And sometimes it's not there in the systems that we're integrating to. It needs to be submitted. It could be risk classifications and whatnot, and then it needs to be maintained going forward. So I think there needs to be a very good practice in submitting these data, having a life cycle of who owns that data, making sure it's always up to date, because ultimately it is what is going to decide whether something is high risk or low risk, and what the access that someone has accumulated is threatening or not. And all of that will tie into how you start applying policies and access reviews in a more scoped manner than what we've seen traditionally, which is, let's have this annual access review, thousands of questions, everyone is tired, to Ivan is high risk because he has this access. He should probably be access reviewed a bit more often than anyone else, and maybe even further. We don't want to do an access review for everything that Ivan has of access, but we just want to take the high risk stuff. So making it a lot more deliberate, not putting fatigue into the organization. I think that has a lot to say. So getting in control of data.
I think if you're wondering today as security leaders, how can I check, right? If you have access reviews of 80 groups with a name that consists out of 32 characters and you don't know what it is, then that's a signal of maybe there's work to do.
I would argue if you do access reviews on AD groups in general, you're probably not that far.
No. But it's consistency on that data level, right? So it's not just adding it, but finding a way of consistently managing that data so that there's consistency around these things so that it actually starts working. So one of the things, I meet a lot of people who are kind of very much at the beginning, say, oh yeah, we're looking into IGA, it's something that we need to do maybe next year. It's like, okay, so have you spoken to HR? What does the data look like? Where's your authoritative data coming from? Is it one source? Is it 2, 3? Right? Is it dynamic values? Or like, do you know what you'll get? And is it predictable? Because I think we had one case with a large telecom provider that overnight 7,000 people lost their access because they used a dynamic value in HR to determine if somebody got access or not, right? So these are the kind of things that you really need to stress test up front. Source data to begin with. Is our identity data trustworthy? Is it, can we trust it? And can we trust it not to change what shouldn't change, right? I mean, certain values can change, like fine, you change position. Great, we've got processes for that. But if you have other, so that's one thing. And then downstream, like your target systems, ensure that your description of a specific, even within the system, you have different roles, right? I mean, in CRM, you've got a sales manager role maybe, or a marketing role, and to have a good description of what it actually is that these people do for their jobs. Not just for the AI, but also for, people, because that's another thing that we can use AI for, of course, is to assist people to figure out what kind of access that they need. And those descriptions will help with someone's like, well, I need to do this and this and this task for my job. Then the AI can be like, well, based on what I know, probably this or this resource. So, there's a lot of things riding on data quality when you want to do an identity program really well.
And I would tell executives before they begin, don't think it's an IT project. It's an entire organizational project. Because ultimately you want IGA to empower your business, not live in IT. And if they have that mindset from the get-go, I think it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah.
And then also, you probably don't solve IGA with a phase 1.
Probably ever. Because there's an acquisition, there's a merger, there's a reorg.
Purchase a new system that's supposed to do a lot.
Change your ERP, you're never done. And this is also a key message. You're never done. This is not a project. It just isn't. It's a cornerstone.
And that puts some emphasis on what you're buying and how you're buying into it, because I don't think a lot of organizations want to buy an IGA solution and then be completely tied up to external sources to do everything for them. It needs to also be something that they can operate and develop on further, because there will be that new CRM system or whatever it is, and controls that they need to switch around. They need to be able to operate something. So that legacy way of thinking of introducing thousands of lines of custom code, I think is going away now. I think people are seeing it. It needs to be something you can operate. It shouldn't take ages to upgrade your solution, because that also ties into security posture. You want those new security vulnerability fixes, all that kind of good stuff. I think that's something that they need to be aware of.
Okay, and then maybe let's get back to Omada as a product. What does the roadmap look like for Omada, the product then?
Well, obviously, we've talked a lot about AI. We're going to do AI for IGA, so introducing where we see it's valuable to have AI help decision makers make decisions based on good data, and of course having a framework around that. We also want to have IGA for AI, and we're going to see more of that later today, how we're going to tackle it for sure. We also get the notion that certain customers want to be more in control, even if it's in the cloud. So I think we're also going to announce today where we're going with that, to give customers more control, even though it's in the cloud.
Okay, cool. All right. Then I think we're at the end of the conversation. And any further questions, maybe?
Maybe we've talked about this paper quite a lot. What were your biggest surprises, let's say, when you read this report? Was there anything that really stood out? Or
For me, not really, because the same goes for you guys. We talk to people all the time. So for me, it kind of validated, what I thought I was learning, from all these conversations I'm having. But I think, and maybe tying it back to, we talk partner first and approach, and you touched a little bit on best practice, and you just mentioned now, it's like, hey, custom lines of code. I think, when we think about roadmap, aside from a product for a second, and we look at, okay, so how are we growing,
As a business, yeah.
as a business, where are we going, is very much, and this is we do it together with you guys, and you guys are directly involved with this, is, applying best practice in how we approach these programs together with our partners, so that we have a tested and trusted and secure and controlled way of at least getting you to that, through that first step, right? That first phase, to your point, phase one, getting control of something, putting the foundation down. And what I hear a lot is that what people need. They don't want to your point, they don't want to be bogged down with all these custom lines of code and stuck in operations. So we will keep developing, based on also with agentic AI, we will come with best practices around how to manage these, and we will find ways of how you do this from a project methodology deployment perspective as well. So besides the product related stuff, which is super exciting, I think we need to still anchor that into real world implementation, anchoring it with the business type of advisory, I guess. Maybe that's the way to put it. I'm not sure that's the right word. Which is where our partners will play a major role, because that is, you've got, I mean, we are an IGA vendor, and Mads and I, we've got a fairly broad view of IAM, and with the background I have too, but you guys live and breathe that piece, and I think that is something that as Omada will keep working on to ensure that we've got a coherent and story, right?
It's also tied to your advice as like starting with an IGA product. Okay, it's like your roadmap, but the IGA product, you also advise get everybody involved, your technical guys, but also your business. And I see a similarity there with what you're saying. The roadmap, okay, there's a technical roadmap, but we also have a business roadmap. And I really see that reflecting back in.
It's funny from a guy selling technology, right? But technology is actually the closing piece of the cycle. Yeah. It's the last thing.
Indeed.
Right? We sometimes, like, people want to start with a demo, and I'm like, okay,
fine, but why?
What do you want us to show? Right? What are you trying to solve? Like, what are the things that make you actually want to speak with a vendor to begin with? I mean, it's scary, talking to a salesperson. Like, why are you talking to a salesperson to begin with? Like, why would your company reserve budget for this, right? Or why? And maybe that's the overall question. It's like, why is what you're doing today not good enough anymore? And then work from there. It's okay. So who would be annoyed or pissed off if we didn't involve them right now? Or who could be, a blocker for you down the road if you didn't bring them in now? It's a lot about, at the beginning, it's not so much about selling technology. It's about selling the idea that you need to do this stuff and to anchor it at the right level, and to give the confidence that if you do all of these things, you will be able to succeed. And by the way, we've got the technology to support that. That it's almost a bit like that. It's kind of implicit. There's different. The technology space has matured. We don't have to be secretive about that. The difference between vendors is sometimes hard to see for our customers. So I think one of the things that we will keep working very hard on, and I think this has served us really well in the past, and particularly with people like yourself and the way we've approached it, is not be just a tech company. No, we are running a program with you guys, right? And this technology is just one element of what we can bring to the table, besides all of the other expertise that we as a vendor, together with the partners, bring. And I think as part of our roadmap, we will keep very much putting a lot of emphasis on that part.
And to the comment of bringing together teams, it's also bringing together platforms. Back to the whole identity fabric thing.
Yes.
We're one piece in that identity fabric, and there are other pieces, but they all have value, and tying everything together makes a greater whole. To the report, one thing that did not surprise me, but just boggles me every single time, is how people begin programs and stop at a certain level, and how so few actually move further into that maturity journey. You have so many people doing a phase 1, 2, and 3 maybe that covers the foundation and some other business critical systems, and then they kind of stop there. Maybe they don't even move into doing access reviews, or maybe they don't start doing risks associated with their resources, all that kind of stuff that actually builds proper compliance. They never really get into that. A lot of companies don't get to that step. They do the first bit, which I will say is joiner, mover, and leavers processes for maybe the basic personal accounts of your biggest systems. And then they kind of halt. And I'm not sure, sometimes it's a funding problem, sometimes it's a priority problem, but many stop there. And that's just the beginning. The next step is obviously, okay, we also have service accounts, agents, privileged accounts. And if you think about it, those are the things that can actually do a lot of damage. And we have too many customers who stop before they hit the more dangerous stuff.
All right.
Yeah.
It's almost, I guess it's a bit tying to what we've said a couple of times, I guess, in the podcast. It's like, it's too much seen as an IT project. And projects by nature end.
Yeah.
It's a program.
Yes, and I think that, well, maybe it could be that the project ends because of funding, could be because people leave, you know, like, but if it's been anchored as a program, then it shouldn't, by nature, shouldn't end. I think this is maybe the paradigm shift that I need to see, you know, at leadership levels. Like, look, this is not a project, this is a program, and because it's a program, it will never end. So we'll need to have an operational budget for this to keep.
Something we're trying to influence is to not only talk about that first phase, but talk about, okay, what do we want to achieve in IGA? And it will have a journey and a timeline aspect to it, but what do we want to achieve? So we have all the components that we can identify laid down, not just that phase 1. Because if you just have that phase 1 with whatever that includes, you kind of look at it too much and you become blind. You need to also see what's ahead, so that when phase 1 ends, you know what to look forward to. And that can also allow for planning, budgeting, forecasting, and all that kind of stuff. I think that enables it, but I think that's what we need to do so that people don't stop at the phase 1 or 2 and think that was enough. Now we check the boxes.
All right, let's conclude then. Just start a program instead of a project. I really want to thank you guys. So this was the episode here at the Omada Identity Security Tour in Utrecht. Thank you, Iwan, Mads, Yannick, for joining. And thanks to you guys who are watching or who tuned in for listening and watching to this podcast. See you on the next